Alexander the Great. Welcome, dear insomniac scholar, to a tale of legend, ego, and entirely too much horse riding. Tonight, we're cracking open the dusty scrolls to meet a man who single-handedly rebranded world domination into a lifestyle. Alexander the Great. Yes, that Alexander. Macedonian royalty, Persian pulverizer, occasional god, self-proclaimed naturally, and the only man in history who managed to conquer half the known world before turning 33, and still somehow didn't find time to settle down. Now, I hear your weary sighs. Already, another dead guy with a sword. Fair. But Alexander isn't just any Bronze Age bicep with ambition. This is a man whose name has echoed down over 2,000 years of art, literature, politics, and insecure dictators trying to cosplay his greatness. There's a reason he gets the Great stamp. And spoiler alert, it's not humility. Before we dive into the chaos, let's establish a few things. Alexander wasn't a nice guy. He was brilliant, ruthless, theatrical, and frankly exhausting. He was raised to believe he was descended from gods, which, as you might expect, did wonders for his personality. He grew up on a steady diet of Aristotle and vengeance, and he had all the subtlety of a lightning bolt through a wine jug. Yet, he was also magnetic. His enemies respected him, his soldiers adored him, and his horse apparently was the only creature who truly understood him. More on that later. So, who was Alexander the Great? He was born in 356 B.C. in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, a kingdom perched on the edge of Greece that was often regarded by snooty Athenian philosophers as a bit too hillbilly for polite society. His father was Philip II, a war-hardened king who could out-strategize a chessboard and out-party a bacchanalia. His mother was Olympus, a Maloyan princess who worshipped snakes, manipulated dynasties like a Game of Thrones character, and allegedly whispered to her son that he was the child of Zeus. Which you know is a normal thing to tell a toddler. Alexander was forged in a crucible of ambition, violence, and divine delusion. By the time he was a teenager, he could quote Homer, dissect philosophy, and kill a man. Not necessarily in that order. He wasn't just trained to rule. He was trained to conquer. And that's exactly what he did. From Greece to Egypt, through Persia and all the way to the edges of India, Alexander marched with his army like a human wildfire. Cities fell before him. Kings knelt. His hair looked fabulous throughout. But while the world sees him as a military genius, there's more to the story. Alexander wasn't just about swords and strategy. He had vision, a warped, world-devouring, occasionally drunken vision, but vision nonetheless. He spread Greek culture like a caffeinated ambassador of civilization, founding cities wherever he went, many of which he named after himself, because of course he did. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Other Alexandrias, not so much. But the point remains, he wanted to create a fusion of East and West to unite people under one empire. One language, one philosophy, preferably his. Still, for all his grandeur, the man was mortal. He had friends, enemies, lovers, breakdowns. He wept when there were no more worlds to conquer, which in fairness is a mood. He made terrible choices. He died young. And yet, the world never quite let him go. Historians have spent millennia picking over his bones, trying to figure out what made him tick. Was he a genius or a megalomaniac? A visionary or a tyrant? The truth, as always, is somewhere in the wine-soaked middle. So why are we still talking about him? Because Alexander was the original overachiever. Because he changed the shape of the world. because he reminds us what happens when a human believes he can outshine the gods and gets alarmingly close. And because, let's face it, history needs its drama queens. So fluff your pillow, dim the torchlight, and get ready to journey into the messy, magnificent life of the boy who would be king, god, and legend, all before he hit midlife crisis age. Next up, meet the parents. Spoiler, they're a whole circus unto themselves. Meet the parents. Philip, Olympus, and the hot mess that was the ancient world. Buckle up your sandals and pour yourself a goblet of something non-toxic. We're rewinding the drama reel to before Alexander came screaming into this world. Because to understand the chaos of the man, you've got to meet the chaos that birthed him. And oh, what chaos it was. Let's start with dear old dad Philip II of Macedon. Now Philip didn't just roll out of bed and decide to become a warlord. He crawled out of decades of Macedonian political dumpster fires, sharpened his wits on backstabbing courtiers, and spent his formative years as a hostage in Thebes where he learned the art of Greek warfare from people who could win a battle while quoting poetry. You know, casual. By the time he got back to Macedon, the place was a mess. Think Game of Thrones. But with fewer dragons and more goats. Neighboring tribes were invading. The nobles were busy assassinating each other. And no one could keep a crown on their head without also attracting a knife to the back. Philip, however, had plans. He restructured the army, invented a new kind of spear formation called the phalanx, basically a very polite wall of death, and began stomping through northern Greece like he'd just unlocked cheat codes. And then there's Olympus, Alexander's mom, and one of the ancient world's most formidable femme fatales. She was a Maloyan princess from Epirus, which was basically ancient Albania, but with more snakes. Speaking of snakes, Olympias was reportedly a fan, as in she may or may not have slept with them, worshipped them, and let them slither around the palace to freak people out. Whether this was religious devotion or top-tier gaslighting remains unclear. But it worked. People kept their distance. Olympus was fiercely intelligent, deeply spiritual, and absolutely not here for your patriarchal nonsense. She also had a temper like Mount Etna and ambitions taller than Olympus. When she married Philip, it wasn't just a royal match. It was the start of a psychological warfare campaign that would last until, well, forever. Their marriage was a battlefield. He had affairs. She threw curses. He won wars. She won hearts or poisoned them depending on the day. Together they created Alexander. Or as Olympus insisted, Alexander the son of Zeus. Because a regular king apparently wasn't divine enough. She told him that one night she dreamed a thunderbolt struck her womb. Yes, really. And that this was a sign that he was destined for greatness. Was she lying? Delusional? Just really creative? Hard to say. But Alexander believed it. And that belief that he was special, God-kissed, unstoppable, became the engine that powered his entire life. Now, let's zoom out. What was the world like before Alexander started repainting the map with blood and ambition? A mess. A fabulous, violent, silk-draped mess. The Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes were constantly bickering like rival TikTok influences. They just wrapped up the Peloponnesian War where Athens lost its crown and Sparta realized that running a military cult didn't translate well to running an economy. Persia, meanwhile, was the superpower in the East. A massive empire with shiny roads, bureaucratic efficiency, and a talent for letting conquered people keep their gods as long as they paid their taxes. Greece was politically exhausted. Persia was huge but bloated. And into this awkward power vacuum stepped Macedonia, the scrappy underdog everyone used to mock for wearing animal skins and having unpronounceable names. But thanks to Philipp's military brilliance and Olympus's ruthless dynastic maneuvering, Macedon went from punchline to powerhouse in the span of a generation. Philip didn't just unify Macedon. He conquered the rest of Greece, outsmarted the Athenian philosophers, and set his sights on Persia. And here's the kicker. Just when he was about to launch his invasion, he got stabbed in the ribs at a wedding by one of his own bodyguards at his daughter's wedding in front of half the Greek nobility. The ancient world didn't do subtlety. Some say Olympus was involved in the assassination. Some say Alexander knew about it. Some say it was just core politics with extra wine. But the end result was this. Philip was dead. The world was on fire. And into that fire stepped a 20-year-old Alexander with daddy issues, a god complex, and a battle-hardened army. The ancient world didn't know what hit it. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a palace full of snakes, a king sharpening his sword by candlelight, and a boy being told by his mother that the sky itself had fathered him. That, my friends, is where our story truly begins. Birth of a storm, baby Alexander and the not-so-terrible twos. The miracle of birth. That soft, tender moment when a new life enters the world to the sound of gentle lullabies and cooing midwives. Unless, of course, you're Alexander the Great, in which case your arrival comes with omens, explosions, and possibly divine thunderbolts. Subtlety was not in the cards. The year 356 BCE. The place Pella, the royal capital of Macedonia. A place that smelled faintly of ambition, olive oil, and boiling political tension. On the night Alexander was born, a few little things happened. Casual background noise like the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus and one of the 7 wonders of the world catching fire and burning to the ground. The Greek historian Plutarch would later claim it was because Artemis was too busy attending Alexander's birth to save her own temple. Priorities, right? Also, on that same night, Philip received word of a major military victory. His horses had won at the Olympic Games, and a third messenger came bearing news of a successful siege in Uria. 3 victories, 1 baby. Coincidence? Olympus would say, absolutely not. She was already claiming divine involvement. The gods, she insisted, were clearly marking this child as extraordinary, or at least very well-timed. Let's talk about that baby. Legend has it Alexander didn't cry like a normal infant. Oh, no. He apparently stared wide-eyed at the room, silent, intense, as if calculating which nursemaid was the weakest, and how best to subdue the cradle. Okay, that might be poetic license, but it's fair to say he was not a chill child. He was obsessed with competition, burned with curiosity, and allegedly had no patience for lazy answers or weak logic. From the very beginning, his parents and particularly Olympus treated him as more than just a royal brat. She fed him stories of heroes and gods. Achilles especially became Alexander's North Star. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, idolized heroic virtue, and probably practiced dramatic battlefield poses in the mirror before he even had teeth. Philip, for his part, saw the potential, but also the danger. He knew that a son raised to believe he was descended from gods might eventually think he should rule more than just Macedon. And Philip was still very much alive and quite attached to his throne. Their father-son relationship was a tangled mess of admiration, suspicion, and subtle power plays. It was basically an ancient version of succession, but with more stabbing and fewer legal departments. Now, the world Alexander was born into was sharp-edged. Macedonian courts weren't exactly safe havens. They were power arenas filled with scheming nobles, bitter step-siblings, and opportunistic generals. Baby Alex's crib was surrounded not by teddy bears, but by intrigue and political knives sharpened behind silk curtains. Even as a toddler, he had to be clever, charming, and alert, according to law. One of the first real signs of his outlandish destiny came when he was about 10 years old. A fiery bucking horse was brought to Philip. No one could ride it. Everyone gave up. It was a dangerous beast and too wild, too proud, too much. And then little Alexander stepped forward. He observed the horse's behavior and realized it was afraid of its shadow. So he turned it toward the sun and rode it like a born warrior. The crowd went wild. Philip reportedly wept and said, "My boy, seek a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small." Well, that aged like prophecy. Alexander named him Bucephalus and kept him for most of his life. He loved that horse more than he loved most people. And to be fair, Bucephalus probably had better manners. That bond, that understanding of fear and control told the world two things. Alexander was unusually perceptive and completely unafraid of risk. His early education wasn't just memorizing poetry and swordplay. Olympus immersed him in mysticism and mythology, while Philip ensured he was trained in strategy, rhetoric, and realpolitik. The boy was learning to read both omens and enemy formations before most kids figured out how to tie their sandals. Even his play was intense. Other kids played pretend battles. Alexander staged them. He led bands of friends on mock conquests. He made speeches to imaginary troops. He gave orders with unnerving precision. Teachers noticed. Generals noticed. The palace staff were probably terrified. He wasn't just clever. He was hungry. Hungry to be more. To know more. To mean more. He had the energy of a gifted child raised in a pressure cooker of prophecy. He was, in short, destined to make everyone around him very tired. So, as your head sinks into your pillow, picture this. A palace flickering with torchlight. A wildy child watching soldiers drill in courtyard. A mother whispering that he was born to reshape the world. And a father silently wondering if he'd just raised his own replacement. Aristotle enters the chat. Philosophy, power, and one very smug tutor gather around drowsy disciples of drama. Because now we meet the man who tried to tame the most ambitious teenage brain in ancient history. No, not a therapist. Not even a royal babysitter with an emergency wine stash. We're talking Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. Student of Plato. Teacher of logic. Master of smug superiority. And for a brief but intense moment, tutor to Alexander the Great. Now, a quick reminder. By this point in our story, Alexander isn't some pudgy prinkling playing with sticks. He's a sharp-minded adolescent with lightning in his eyes and a sword-shaped chip on his shoulder. He's already got the instincts of a general and the ego of a minor deity. In other words, prime candidate for a deep dive into ethics and epistemology. So, how did the greatest philosopher of the time end up coaching the world's most caffeinated teenager? Simple. Philip II made a deal. Philip, ever the strategist, recognized that brute strength could only get you so far. If Alexander was going to inherit an empire, or more likely, build one with blood and bravado, he needed brains to match. Enter Aristotle, who had been lurking in philosophical exile after annoying Plato's fanboys by suggesting maybe the universe didn't revolve entirely around abstract perfection. Scandalous. Truly. Philip offered Aristotle a juicy gig. Tutor the heir to the Macedonian throne with a cushy base of operations in a quiet little town called Mysa. The caveat: the student in question might try to conquer your soul by lunchtime. Still, Aristotle said yes. Because let's face it, teaching Alexander was the ultimate resume booster. Their classroom was a no-dusty dungeon of scrolls. It was more like a philosophical boot camp nestled in nature. Macedonian Ivy League minus the tuition and plus the bodyguards. Alexander and a handful of noble-born friends, future generals, were given an education in everything. Literature, ethics, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, logic, and of course, Homer. Lots and lots of Homer. Now, Homer wasn't just some bedtime poetry for Alexander. He saw the Iliad as a manual, a life coach in verse. Achilles was his spiritual older brother. Brave, tragic, gloriously unhinged. Aristotle, ever the pragmatist, tried to nudge him toward moderation. Yes, glory is great, but have you considered rational thought? Alexander listened. Kind of. He absorbed. He debated. He questioned everything. He had that deadly blend of curiosity and confidence. The kind that makes teachers weep with pride and fear. He wasn't content to memorize. He wanted to argue, to challenge. He was learning the names of stars while dreaming of marching through them. Aristotle gave him tools. Rhetoric for persuasion. Logic for decisions. Ethics for image management. He taught him how to read people like battlefields. How to wield words like weapons. In a way, Aristotle helped sharpen the blade of Alexander's charisma. Turned that raw hunger into something more strategic. And if Alexander didn't always agree with his teacher, he never forgot him. In fact, when Alexander eventually began conquering the known world, he sent Aristotle specimens, books, even data from far-off lands. He founded libraries. He encouraged Greek-style education in the cities he built. Somewhere in that war-hardened heart, the seeds of philosophy had taken root. But let's not pretend it was all hugs and metaphysics. Alexander had an ego that required its own postal code. Aristotle, meanwhile, believed in hierarchy and didn't love the idea of his student becoming a self-declared god. Their relationship was laced with respect. Yes, but also a healthy dose of eye-rolling. Later in life, Alexander would adopt customs Aristotle abhorred, like bowing rituals from Persia or mixing cultures in ways that made Greek purists choke on their olives. Some say Aristotle turned against him. Others say he just sighed deeply and wrote another book about ethics. But during those years at Myaza, there was something magical, a mind being shaped not just by ambition, but by wisdom. Alexander learned how to think beyond the battlefield. He learned that power wasn't just about crushing enemies. It was about influence, perception, and legacy. So tonight, as you drift into your dreams, imagine a shady grove, two figures sitting cross-legged beneath the trees. One old, methodical, carrying the weight of philosophical tradition. The other young, restless, staring into the future like it was already his. That's where empires begin. Not with swords, but with ideas. Next up, Alexander gets his first taste of real battle. Spoiler. He's frighteningly good at it. Young Alexander. Teenage thunder and the art of war. You've met the parents. You've seen the baby. Don't stare. It'll glare back. You've sat through Aristotle's lecture series on virtue with only mild existential dread. Now we step into the arena where Alexander truly begins to shine. Warfare. Not pretend battles in the royal garden. Not theoretical strategies in philosophy class. No, we're talking real sharp screaming blood and sand kind of war. And wouldn't you know it, the kids are natural. Let's set the scene. Alexander is in his mid-teens. Most ancient youths his age were still learning how not to stab themselves during spear drills. Alexander, he was already commanding troops, advising generals, and giving his father unsolicited tactical advice, which incredibly worked. Philip might have been one of the greatest military minds of the ancient world, but even he had to admit the boy had something. Vision, nerve, possibly a tiny addiction to battlefield glory. So when do we first see him in action? That would be the Battle of Chyrenia 338 B.C. Alexander was just 18. Philip led the Macedonian army against a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes, who had decided they were tired of being bossed around by Macedonian hill people. It was a big deal, a dramatic standoff. Think Avengers-level crossover, but with more shouting in ancient Greek. Now, Philip, being no fool, didn't throw his teenage son onto the battlefield as some ceremonial mascot. He gave Alexander command of the left flank, a key position, in a moment that would go down in every fanboy history scroll ever written. Alexander didn't just hold the line. He broke the elite sacred band of thieves, an elite unit considered nearly invincible. He shattered their formation with speed, precision, and a lovely little cavalry maneuver that probably made his tutors weep with pride and horror. He led a cavalry charge straight into the heart of the enemy's right flank. But it wasn't just a reckless run. He waited for the right moment, timed it perfectly with his father's feigned retreat on the opposite flank, and then smashed into the Thean line, catching them off guard and splitting their formation. This disrupted the cohesion of the sacred band. And once that happened, the rest of the army began to fall apart. Philip and Alexander's coordinated move was classic Macedonian hammer and anvil. Infantry pins, cavalry strikes. Alexander played the hammer hard. That battle sealed it. He wasn't just the prince. He was the real deal. After Chyrona, the respect from the army shifted. They no longer saw him as just the boss's kid with dramatic hair. They saw him as a leader. Soldiers started whispering his name with a mix of awe and mild fear, which honestly is exactly how Alexander liked it. But it wasn't all victory parades. Alexander's life at this point was a careful balancing act. Between worshipping his father and resenting his shadow, Philip was busy expanding his power, consolidating Greek territory under the League of Corinth, and planning the invasion of Persia. Alexander, meanwhile, was being groomed but not yet unleashed. And then came the family drama because of course there was family drama. Philip married again a much younger woman named Cleopatra Eurid. Not to be confused with Cleopatra of Egypt. We'll get to her much later. Olympus was furious. Alexander was furious. During the wedding feast, one of Philip's generals made a drunken toast about hoping for a legitimate heir, which translated meant, hey, maybe now we'll get a prince who isn't half foreign and full ego. Alexander, never one to quietly absorb insults, threw his goblet, shouted something suitably dramatic, and stormed out, dragging his mother with him. They both went into temporary exile like the ancient version of a Real Housewives spin-off. Philip eventually smoothed things over, but the cracks were showing. The mentor had become a rival. The prince was no longer content to wait. Still, Alexander kept rising. He governed in Philip's absence, led campaigns in Thrace, quelled rebellions, and charmed diplomats. He was smart, stylish, terrifyingly well-read, and increasingly aware that he could do it better than the man who taught him everything. Then, plot twist, Philip was assassinated right before launching his great campaign against Persia at a wedding by one of his own bodyguards. The ancient world, as we've discussed, loved a good, dramatic exit. Alexander, now just 20, didn't blink. He rode straight to the capital, secured the loyalty of the army, eliminated rival claimants with just enough ruthless efficiency to raise eyebrows, and proclaimed himself king of Macedon. It was fast, brutal, controlled. The boy who'd studied strategy now embodied it. He didn't wait. He didn't beg. He didn't falter. He was ready. And as you drift off tonight, imagine that young man standing on a hill, staring down the lands his father never got to conquer. Behind him, the smoking ruins of rebellion. Ahead of him, an empire waiting to be taken. His sword gleaming, his mind burning. The storm had arrived, and its name was Alexander. Long live the king. Crown chaos and the art of ruthless ascension. Monarchy, that glamorous mix of inherited power, uncomfortable sandals, and the ever-present threat of being stabbed by your cousin. When we left our glittering protagonist, he was standing triumphant over the body of his assassinated father, Philip II. Not literally, mind you, though honestly, with this family, you wouldn't put it past them. Alexander is now 20 years old. Most of us at that age are still deciding what we want for breakfast. Alexander, he's deciding how best to consolidate a kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war. No pressure. Let's be clear. Philip's murder created a vacuum. And in monarchies, vacuums tend to be filled with daggers and dynastic hissy fits. The minute the big man dropped dead, the Macedonian court practically exploded into panic. Plotting and opportunistic mustache twirling. Rivals appeared like mushrooms after rain. Half-brothers, disgruntled generals, exiled nobles, and the ever-present threat of an anti-Alexander faction, hoping to swap the dramatic heir for someone more manageable. Spoiler, that didn't happen. Alexander moved fast. The man could have taught masterclasses in decisive action. He secured the army's loyalty within hours. The same soldiers who had bled beside Philip now saluted the young lion, partly because they respected him and partly because he looked like he might personally strangle anyone who didn't. Next, clean up. Alexander went full Game of Thrones. He ordered the execution of potential rivals, including a few extended family members who'd had the audacity to exist near the royal bloodline. Cleopatra Eurytix, the new wife. Remember her, and her infant child gone. Olympia may have had a hand in that one. Never let it be said that she didn't support her son's career with deadly enthusiasm. Within weeks, Macedon was locked down tight. But Alexander didn't just want to sit on a throne and sip wine while poets sang of his cheekbones. Oh no. He had bigger ambitions. His father's Persian campaign plans were still on the table. And Alexander wasn't about to let that opportunity rot. But first, some housekeeping. Several Greek city-states believing Philip's death meant woo-woo-hoo independence began murmuring about rebellion. Thieves Athens always ready for a bit of anti-Macedonian mischief. Alexander could have written them a strongly worded scroll. Instead, he marched an army south. He reached Thebes so fast that people reportedly fainted just from the news of his approach. What followed was diplomacy with teeth. He offered clemency. Thebes refused. So Alexander destroyed the city, completely leveled it, burned it, left just a few buildings standing, temples mostly, and sold survivors into slavery. It was calculated terror. A message carved into stone and scorched into the Greek psyche. Don't test me. Athens got the hint. With Greece subdued and Macedon secured, Alexander turned his eyes east to Persia, the largest empire the world had ever seen. But let's pause before the conquest starts, because this chapter is about how he became king. Not just logistically, but psychologically. This wasn't just about sitting in Philip's chair. This was about crafting a myth. Alexander wanted to be seen not only as a ruler, but as the inevitable force of destiny. He linked himself to heroes. He referenced omens. He portrayed himself as the fulfillment of something larger, as if the universe itself had passed the crown to him. He dressed differently. He moved with theatrical grace. He began surrounding himself with loyalists who understood his vision, not just his orders. Some whispered that he was becoming arrogant. Others said he was simply preparing to wear history like a second skin. And he was still young. Too young by most standards. But age doesn't matter when you radiate the kind of unshakable conviction that makes grown men bow without being asked. So now he was king not just of Macedon but of an idea. A new era. An ambition with armor. And as you drift off tonight, imagine the torches flickering across the royal palace in Pella. Imagine a young man pacing the stone corridors. Eyes fixed eastward. Heart beating not with fear but with fire. Behind him the old world crumbled, before him a new one waited. Trembling Blitzkrieg with a bronze sword. Alexander's conquests and expansion extravaganza. All right, my bedtime battalion. Stretch your legs and refill your goblet of goat's milk or whatever ancient insomnia cure you're sipping, because now we march. The stage is set. The throne is his. The rivals are silenced. And now Alexander does what Alexander does best. Go full war tornado across 3 continents. Let's start with a little context. The Persian Empire was massive. We're talking 1 million square miles of bureaucracy, satraps, and excellent roads. It stretched from Asia Minor to Egypt to the edge of India. It had stood for over 2 centuries and was ruled by King Darius III, who was probably just trying to enjoy some palace grapes when this brash Macedonian upstart declared war. Darius had inherited a system of governance built on paperwork, compromise, and bribes, all things Alexander had little patience for. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellas Pond, that skinny strip of water between Europe and Asia, with about 40,000 troops and enough self-confidence to power a small city-state. Not exactly a world-destroying force, but lean, loyal, and terrifyingly effective. First thing he does, visits the legendary ruins of Troy, pays homage to Achilles, and probably whispers some manly nonsense to the sea breeze about destiny and vengeance. He then supposedly throws a spear into the Asian soil, claiming the continent as his by divine right. Modest. Then comes the first major clash, the Battle of the Granicus River. Persian satraps gather a sizable force and line the opposite riverbank, expecting Alexander to wait until morning like a sensible general. Alexander naturally charges immediately with the cavalry across a river into spears. He personally leads the attack because he's Alexander and that's what he does. During the chaos, a Persian noble nearly kills him. He's saved by a bodyguard who cleaves the attacker down just in time. It's messy, brutal, and decisive. Alexander wins. A few cities surrender immediately. Others try resistance. That goes poorly for them. Now Alexander turns his eyes south along the Ionian coast. Ephesus, Miletus, Halicarnassus. City after city falls. In many, he liberates them from Persian rule and reinstates democratic governments. Sounds nice, right? But let's not kid ourselves. These are Greek-style democracies, which usually means you can vote as long as you vote for Alexander. Still, this combination of sword and soft power works wonders. Locals begin to see him as less a conqueror and more a liberator with very specific architectural tastes. Then comes 333 BCE and the Battle of Issus. Darius himself appears at last, bringing a vastly larger force. Alexander, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, turns the terrain to his advantage. He breaks the Persian line with a bold charge straight for Darius, who panics and flees again, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treats them well, offers them protection and royal treatment. Why? Because it makes him look like a noble king, not just a warlord, and it embarrasses Darius deeply. The symbolism is delicious. Alexander now has momentum and swagger. He heads to the Phoenician coast where he expects the port cities to surrender. Most do. But Tyre, an island fortress, says no. So Alexander builds a causeway across open sea. Takes 7 months. a flood of resources and an uncomfortable amount of engineering. But he takes Tyre. He rewards resistance with fire and blood and mercy for those who submit. That delicate balance becomes a pattern. Resistance is crushed. Surrender is rewarded. It's not morality. It's method. Then it's on to Egypt. And here things get strange and spiritual. The Egyptians, long oppressed under Persian rule, welcome him like a savior. At Memphis, he is crowned pharaoh. But the real mystical turning point comes at the Sewa oasis where Alexander visits the oracle of Zeus Ammon. The priests declare him divine, the son of the god. Whether they actually said this or Alexander just heard what he wanted is a historical shrug. But from that moment on, he doubles down on the god-king persona. Backed by both Eastern mysticism and Greek destiny, he becomes unstoppable. He founds Alexandria, the most famous of his named twin cities, strategically placed at the mouth of the Nile. It becomes a hub of learning, commerce, and future Cleopatra drama. It also becomes a symbol of his vision: fusion, progress, dominance. Next, the final blow to Persia. 331 B.C. Battle of Gamala. Darius assembles what should be an unbeatable force. Elite troops, scythe chariots, war elephants, and superior numbers. Alexander studies the terrain, splits his forces with finesse, and again makes a straight line beeline for Darius himself. The Persian line collapses. Darius flees again. Alexander captures the Persian capitals: Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana, and finally Pepololis, the opulent heart of Persia. He lets his troops plunder. He later burns the royal palace, maybe as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century earlier. Maybe because he was drunk and melancholic. Maybe both. Either way, the fire becomes a symbol, the end of the Persian Empire. But Alexander isn't done. He could have stopped. He should have stopped. But no. He chases Darius into the east. The Persian king is eventually murdered by his own satraps. Hoping to curry favor, Alexander is furious. He has the traitors executed. In a twist of twisted chivalry, he buries Darius with royal honors, positioning himself as not just the conqueror of Persia, but its rightful successor. Now he pushes into Central Asia, into Bactria, Sugdana, and beyond. Here the warfare turns more difficult. Guerrilla tactics, mountain tribes, and endless resistance. But Alexander adapts. He marries Roxana, a Bactrian princess. He trains local troops. He integrates foreign customs. This isn't just empire building. It's cultural engineering. Then comes India. In 326 BCE, Alexander crosses the Indus River and meets King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Porus brings war elephants and fierce resistance. The battle is vicious. Mud, rain, panic. But Alexander's tactics triumph again. He wins. And then, in a move of respect, he returns Porus's kingdom and makes him an ally. Why? Because Alexander admires strength, even in his enemies. But his men have had enough. They've marched 11 years, fought through deserts, jungles, and mountains. They're exhausted, homesick, and terrified of what lies further east. At the Hephaestus River, they mutiny, not dramatically, just with quiet, resolute refusal. And Alexander finally stops. They begin the march home, but not the easy route. He takes them through the Grosian Desert, a blistering, hellish expanse that kills thousands. Was it punishment? Was it hubris? Was it another test? No one knows. But Alexander survives. Enough of his army does. To, just barely, dragging what's left of the dream across the sand. In 324 BCE, they return to Babylon. Alexander is only 31. He has conquered the greatest empire in history, founded more than 20 cities, changed the course of civilizations. And yet, as he stares eastward from Babylon, one thought lingers in his mind. What's next? As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the world unrolling beneath his feet like a map. Dusty roads stretching into the unknown. Broken empires behind him. A crown that no longer fits his ambition. And a silence creeping in where battle once roared. The later years. Gods. Ghosts. And the cracks in the crown. Now we drift into the final years of Alexander's meteoric existence. The period where the victories pile up. But so do the cracks. The empire is at its height. His legend is solid gold. And yet something in the air shifts. The conqueror who once marched with clarity begins to waver, wander, and dare we say, come undone. We pick up in Babylon, the shimmering jewel of the ancient world. A city with hanging gardens, maybe stargazing priests, and enough wealth to drown a small kingdom. It's here that Alexander begins acting well stranger than usual. After over a decade of relentless conquest, he isn't planning retirement. He's planning more. More campaigns. More cities. More deification. Because ruling the largest empire the world had ever seen. Not enough. Clearly. Let's be fair. The man's not just delusional. He's tired physically. Mentally. Existentially. The weight of an empire would put creases in anyone's bronze forehead. And then in 324 BCE, something that really shakes him. The death of Hephaestion, his closest companion general. And depending who you ask, the love of his life. We'll deep dive into her Phaeacian later. But for now know this. His death devastates Alexander. He doesn't just mourn. He unravels. Refuses to eat. Declares national mourning. Orders heroic honors usually reserved for demigods. A temple is planned. Monuments are built. Poets are hired. The grief is mythicized. From this moment, everything becomes grander and darker. He starts leaning harder into his god-king persona. Insists on rituals where subjects must prostrate themselves before him. A Persian custom called proskynesis that horrifies his Greek and Macedonian officers. To them, kings are men, not deities. But Alexander is mixing cultures, rebranding the monarchy, rewriting divinity in his image. And it's not going down well. Whispers grow louder. His generals grumble. His soldiers are restless. He starts having people executed for plotting or even just being inconvenient. Old friends fall out of favor. Tensions rise. Is it paranoia? Is it justified? Hard to tell. When you've crushed entire nations, a little mistrust isn't unreasonable. He pushes reforms, integrating Persians into the army, encouraging intermarriage between Macedonians and local women, attempting to create a hybrid elite. The idea is grand, a truly blended empire, but the execution chaotic. Resentments simmer, cultures clash. Macedonians feel betrayed. Persians feel patronized. No one's quite sure what to make of this cosmopolitan fever dream. Still he presses on. Plans another campaign. This time into Arabia. But no one knows. Maybe ambition. Maybe boredom. Maybe he just didn't know how to stop. The man had been marching since his teens. Stopping would mean what exactly? Sitting on a throne. Hosting banquets. Playing board games with minor satraps. Please. And then in 323 BCE, he falls ill. The reports are murky. Some say malaria. Others say typhoid or liver failure. A few suggest poison because why not throw in one last conspiracy? He's struck by a fever in Babylon and doesn't recover. Days pass. His generals hover. His empire holds its breath. When asked to whom he leaves his empire, he reportedly mutters, "To the strongest." Of course he does. Alexander dies on June 10th or 11th. 323 BCE at the age of 32. No epic final battle. No divine chariot sweeping him away. Just a man burning out. The reaction. Chaos. His generals scramble for power. His mother weeps. His body is embalmed like a pharaoh and placed in a golden sarcophagus. His funeral procession is intercepted. His tomb hijacked. Eventually, he's buried in Alexandria, though the exact location has been lost to time. And no, we haven't found it yet. But what's left in the wake of that fevered death? An empire that stretches from Greece to India. Dozens of cities bearing his name. A shattered political system. And a generation of people asking themselves what it all meant. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a flickering oil lamp in a Babylonian chamber. A young king barely past 30, staring into the dark. No enemies left. No wars to fight. Only silence. The kind that comes after God's fall. Next up, love, lust, and possibly a few diplomatic marriages. Alexander's romantic life. Complicated. Controversial. And absolutely not monogamous. Affairs of the crown. Alexander's love life. Spoiler. It's complicated. This chapter. The romantic entanglements of a man who conquered most of the known world, but couldn't apparently commit to a single definition of love. Yes, it's time to slide into the silk-draped boudoir of Alexander the Great. Now I hear you. Wasn't he too busy crushing empires to care about candle-lit dinners? Sweet listener, if history teaches us anything, it's that power and passion are almost always co-stars. And Alexander, for all his battlefield bravado and divine declarations, was very human when it came to matters of the heart. Dramatic, even predictably complicated, deeply strategic, and just occasionally possibly in love. Let's begin with the one name that hovers in every historical whisper. Hestione. More than just a general. More than a friend. Her Hephaestion was Alexander's closest companion. His right hand. His confidant. His fellow student under Aristotle. They were the same age. Trained together. Ate together. And most importantly, thought together. Their minds were linked in that almost eerie way that only happens with true equals. To the ancient eye, they were inseparable. And no, the ancient sources don't give us a Hallmark card confession. But even the famously buttoned-up historians of the time couldn't hide how deep this bond was. Alexander compared their relationship to that of Achilles and Patroclus, which, let's be honest, is about as subtle as shouting, "We're soulmates," through a war horn. The implication wouldn't have been lost on their contemporaries. The two shared not only campfires and command, but emotional intimacy. There are records of their letters, stories of them riding side by side into battle, sleeping in the same tent, and finishing each other's sentences, probably while glaring at map-scribbling advisors. Hestione was more than a military officer. He was Alexander's emotional anchor. When Alexander was crowned pharaoh in Egypt, Hestione was right there. When Alexander married into Persian royalty, Hestione also married a noble woman who happened to be the sister of Alexander's new wife. Because if Alexander was building a dynasty, Hestione was going to be part of it. Then came 324 BCE and Hestione died suddenly in Ecbatana. The devastation was immediate and absolute. Alexander collapsed. He refused food. He cut his hair. A dramatic mourning gesture associated with Achilles himself. He ordered heroic funeral rites. including human sacrifices. Yes, dark. He built a massive funeral pyre that was part mourning ritual, part architectural flex. He tried to elevate his Tion to the rank of divine hero, commissioning a temple in his honor. This wasn't just grief. This was epic grief. Monumental. The kind of grief reserved for kings' lovers or both. Now on to the women. Because while he might have held his heart, Alexander's marriages were a whole other battlefield. One with veils, thrones, and diplomatic consequences. Let's start with Roxana, a Bactrian princess captured after a siege in Central Asia. The sources say Alexander saw her, was struck by her beauty, and married her. Some say it was love. Others say it was pure politics. But unlike his other marriages, Roxana remained by his side. She traveled with him. She lived in his court. And when he died, she was carrying his only legitimate heir. Think about that. Out of all his romantic or strategic relationships, only Roxana bore his child. That tells us something. She may have started as a political convenience, but she became the wife. After Alexander's death, she moved ruthlessly to protect their son's claim, even reportedly murdering his other wives and rivals to clear the way. Subtle. Nope. Loyal. Very. Then came the Sousa weddings. If you thought mass marriages were a modern invention for reality TV, think again. In a grand act of imperial theater, Alexander gathered his top 80 officers in 324 BCE and had them all marry Persian noble women in a mass ceremony in Susa. Why? Because Alexander wanted to knit East and West into one empire, and he figured a few shared wedding registries would help. He himself married 2 women that day. Statera, the daughter of defeated King Darius III, and Parisardis, the daughter of the former Persian king Artaxerxes III. Was it romantic? About as romantic as a tax treaty. These marriages weren't about love. They were about optics. A public spectacle to broadcast unity across cultural lines. But the reality was messier. Most of the Macedonian officers weren't thrilled. They resented the forced unions. Resented the idea of abandoning their Greek identity. Within a few years, many of the couples had quietly separated. But the message lingered. Alexander was trying to build not just an empire, but a hybrid civilization, and he was willing to use marriage to do it. So who was Alexander in love with? Hephaestion, almost certainly. Roxana, possibly. His image definitely, but love to Alexander was never a simple affair. It was interwoven with power, loyalty, vision, and legacy. He used love as he used everything else strategically. Yet he also felt deeply. He mourned deeply. He expected loyalty and gave it sometimes fatally. He was a man who read Sappho and Homer, who lived for greatness but craved connection. As you lay back tonight, picture the flicker of candlelight in the royal tent. A scroll half-finished on the table. A goblet untouched. A man sitting alone, remembering a friend now lost to the shadows of myth. A wife asleep nearby. And the weight of a love too complex to name. Bromance and betrayal. Friends for enemies and fatal fallout. Friendship. That delicate bond forged in childhood. Tested by time, and occasionally shattered by imperial ambition and a well-timed dagger. Now, my dreamy historians, we delve into Alexander's inner circle, the friends who followed him across continents, the confidants who shaped his path, and the ones who quite literally didn't survive him. Because while Alexander the Great was many things, king, warrior, philosopher, fanboy, God-complex enthusiast, one thing he absolutely was not easy to be friends with. Let's begin with the companions. Alexander's elite circle of noble-born Macedonian friends trained from childhood to fight, advise, drink, and die beside him. These weren't just bros. These were battle-hardened, educated men who shared his victories, endured his paranoia, and occasionally bore the brunt of his divine moods. We've already met Hephaestion, Alexander's heart and soul twin, whose death left an empire mourning. But there were others, many others, each with their own role to play in this political drama meets ancient war soap opera. Let's talk Ptolemy. Smart, observant, strategic. He was one of Alexander's oldest friends, part of the inner circle since childhood. He served as a general throughout the campaigns. And crucially, he paid attention, while others chased glory. Ptolemy took notes, literally. After Alexander's death, he wrote detailed accounts of the campaigns and then carved out his own empire in Egypt. He even made himself pharaoh. Respect. Ptolemy wasn't flashy. He was survivor-tier clever. The kind of friend who knows when to step forward and when to back away slowly. Especially when the king starts talking like he's Zeus. Then there's Perdiccas. Loyal, competent, and ambitious. The trifecta that made him both indispensable and incredibly dangerous. After Alexander's death, he tried to keep the empire intact, acting as regent for Alexander's young son. Spoiler. It did not go smoothly. More on that later. But not all friendships aged like amphora wine. Antiochus the Black, a seasoned general, a loyal officer. He once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus. Slashed down a Persian noble who was about to skewer the young king. Heroic stuff. But years later in Babylon, things go south. At a drunken banquet, Clitus, probably too many goblets in, starts criticizing Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and comparing him unfavorably to Philip. Now Alexander should have walked away. Instead, in a fit of rage, he grabs a spear and kills Clitus on the spot. The room goes silent, and so does history briefly, because even Alexander knows he went too far. He reportedly collapses in grief and guilt, locking himself in his chambers for days. Was it remorse or just the shock of realizing no one could stop him? Not even himself. Next up, Callisthenes, a philosopher and historian and a nephew of Aristotle. No less. He joined Alexander's court as the official chronicler. His job? Write the glorious history as it unfolded. Problem is, he had opinions, especially when Alexander began requiring proskynesis, the Persian-style bow of submission before royalty. Callisthenes refused openly. That didn't end well. He was accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, and may have been executed or just left to rot in a cell. The message: Alexander liked loyalty. He expected devotion. But dissent, even respectful, even scholarly, was met with steel. Still, not all friendships ended in fire and fury. Some, like with Craterus, a more old-school general, remained rock-solid to the end. Craterus was popular with the rank and file, beloved for his practical mindset, and Alexander trusted him enough to put him in charge of moving a portion of the army back to Macedonia. That's high praise from a man who trusted almost no one by the end. And what about Eumenes, the Greek secretary turned strategist? He wasn't born into nobility, but his intelligence earned him Alexander's favor. After Alexander's death, Eumenes would fight valiantly to keep the empire from collapsing, loyal to the Arad legacy long after others had chosen self-interest. His loyalty was rare and costly. By the end of his life, Alexander's circle had shifted. It was smaller, tenser, more dangerous. The laughter of youth gave way to whispers of rebellion. The camaraderie forged in Myaza's classrooms and on the battlefields of Asia hardened into uneasy alliances. The young king who once sparred with childhood friends now demanded godlike reverence. Friendship with Alexander meant walking a knife's edge between glory and execution. Wine and war, intimacy and exile. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a royal tent under starlit skies. Inside, a king sits surrounded by the ghosts of friends. Some still alive, some long gone. He remembers laughter, battles, betrayals, and the strange sharp truth that the higher you rise, the lonelier the summit becomes. Enemies of the crown, rebels, rivals, and really bad decisions. Now, we slip behind the curtain and meet the people who did the unthinkable. They opposed Alexander. They rebelled. They resisted. They told him no, and then immediately regretted it. Because if you stood in Alexander's way, you had two options: submit and get a statue, or resist and get flattened. Let's start with the most obvious enemy. Darius II, king of Persia. He didn't choose to be Alexander's enemy. He just had the poor luck of being in charge when our favorite Macedonians steamrolled into Asia. Darius, born Artasarta, was a distant relative of the Persian royal line, elevated to the throne around 336 BCE after a palace conspiracy eliminated his predecessor. He was capable but politically unprepared for the hurricane that was Alexander. Caught off guard by the invasion, Darius tried to consolidate control over a vast empire that was already groaning under its own weight. He had the manpower, the wealth, and the legitimacy, but not the speed, flexibility, or sheer magnetism Alexander wielded like a weapon. Their first real face-off, the Battle of Issus, 333 B.C. Darius had superior numbers, war chariots, all the logistics of the greatest empire on earth. Alexander had himself, and yet Darius was outmaneuvered, outplayed. And when Alexander came charging directly at him, Darius did what any proud emperor would do: panicked and ran, leaving behind his family, his mother, his wife, his kids. Alexander found them, treated them with royal dignity, and used them as walking propaganda. After that humiliation, Darius tried peace. He offered ransom, land, even his daughter's hand in marriage. Alexander declined with a polite but firm, "I already own that. Thanks." Next came the decisive Battle of Galgamea, 331 B.C. Darius brought everything: chariots with sides, elephants, an army that dwarfed Alexander's. Once again, Alexander bypassed the flashy parts and aimed straight for Darius. And once again, Darius ran. His troops scattered. His empire crumbled. Not long after, Darius was betrayed and murdered by one of his own satraps. Alexander, in a final flex, gave him a royal burial, making himself look both noble and like the true heir of Persia. But not every enemy came with a crown. Take Bessus Sator of Bactria, a career noble and military commander. Bessus betrayed Darius during his flight and claimed the Persian throne for himself under the name Artaxerxes V. His goal: rally the eastern provinces, slow down Alexander, and rebuild Persian resistance. It was ambitious. It was also short-lived. Alexander pursued him relentlessly through the wilds of modern-day Afghanistan. Once caught, Bessus was tried for regicide and executed in a grotesque display meant to mirror the Persian custom for traitors. His nose and ears cut off before being paraded and finally executed. Then there was Spitamenes, a nobleman from Styana and easily one of the most resourceful and dangerous enemies Alexander ever faced. Unlike the grand armies of Darius, Spitamenes ran a guerrilla war. He incited rebellions, used the terrain to his advantage, and turned local tribes against the Macedonians. His raids nearly cut off Alexander's supply lines. He even managed to kill hundreds of Macedonian troops in a surprise ambush. Took a long, exhausting campaign to corner him, and just like Bessus, Spitamene was betrayed by his own allies, who presented his severed head to Alexander in the hopes of mercy. Spoiler: mercy was not Alexander's favorite dish. Let's rewind to Greece for a moment. Thebes gets an honorable or dishonorable mention. This city-state had a long proud military tradition and had often stood as a rival to Macedonian dominance. After Philip's assassination in 336 B.C., Thebes thought they could reclaim their independence. They allied with Athens, who wisely bailed once they saw Alexander's speed. In response, Alexander showed up within days and destroyed the entire city. Over 30,000 people were either killed or sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar was spared. Thebes became a ghost town and a warning. Among internal threats, Callisthenes, a cousin of Aristotle and court historian, stands out, his crime having a backbone. When Alexander began insisting on proskynesis, the Persian ritual of bowing before the king, Callisthenes refused on cultural and philosophical grounds. He criticized Alexander's divine posturing, not in a rebellion, mind you, but in polite intellectual objection. Big mistake. He was imprisoned, possibly tortured, and likely died in captivity. A quiet but chilling example of what happens when ideology meets absolute power. Then there was Philotas, son of the elderly general Palmon. Philotas was head of Alexander's elite cavalry, the companion cavalry, and wielded significant influence. He was accused of failing to report a plot against Alexander. Whether he was actually involved remains unclear. Under torture, he confessed and was executed. And just to be safe, Alexander sent assassins to kill Palmon. 2. Despite a lack of evidence. Paranoia, sure, but also cold, calculated control. And finally, King Porus of the Pava kingdom, who ruled a region in modern-day Punjab. When Alexander crossed the Indus River, Porus met him at the Battle of the Hydaspes with a formidable army, including war elephants, creatures Alexander's troops had never seen in battle. The clash was brutal, chaotic, and soaked in monsoon rain. Porus fought valiantly. When defeated and brought before Alexander, he was asked how he wished to be treated. Like a king, he replied. Alexander, impressed by his courage, granted him not only his kingdom back, but additional territory. Porus was one of the few enemies Alexander truly respected. It was a rare moment where conquest led to admiration, not annihilation. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the silhouettes of those who stood tall in Alexander's path. Emperors, satraps, rebels, and thinkers. Some died in battle, others by betrayal. A few, like Porus, lived on in legend. They remind us that even in a world bent to one man's will, resistance, however doomed, left its mark. The final curtain, death of a god-king. Now, my dear candle-lit companion, we reach the part of the tale. Every epic eventually arrives at the end. The great conqueror, the myth in motion, the man who claimed to be divine, Alexander the Great, meets the one opponent even he couldn't outmaneuver. Death. Let's set the scene. Babylon 323 BCEE. Alexander is 32 years old. His empire stretches from Greece to the Indus River, stitched together by war, blood, and ambition. He's just returned from his long eastern campaigns. His body is tired. His circle is tense. The politics are unsteady to say the least. But Alexander, he's still dreaming. He's making plans to invade Arabia, maybe even beyond. His hunger for conquest is undiminished. Even if his body is beginning to falter, then a fever, sudden, persistent, unrelenting. He falls ill after attending a banquet. Though whether it was the wine, the food, the exhaustion, or something more sinister remains one of history's great cliffhangers. He begins to deteriorate slowly, over 12 agonizing days. He loses the ability to speak. His generals gather at his bedside. The palace air grows thick with dread. Let's pause here, because Alexander wasn't just a military genius. He was the center of gravity for an entire empire. No clear successor. No named heir. And suddenly he's fading. What killed him? Theories abound. Malaria picked up during one of his campaigns. Typhoid fever exacerbated by poor hygiene and contaminated water. Autoimmune disorders. Alcohol-induced liver failure. And of course, poison. The favorite theory of suspicious minds and salacious storytellers. Poison is unlikely. Ancient poisons weren't exactly subtle. And Alexander's illness lasted nearly 2 weeks. But that hasn't stopped centuries of speculation. What we know is this. On his final day, his generals ask him, "To whom do you leave your empire?" And his answer, whispered or gasped or maybe just imagined, was to the strongest. Classic Alexander, enigmatic to the end. He dies in June 323 B.C., likely on the 10th or 11th. Though records vary. His death sets off immediate panic. No will. No adult heir. His half-brother, the Aratus, is mentally impaired. His wife Roxana is pregnant. The empire is a ticking time bomb. But let's rewind a moment. In death, as in life, Alexander refuses to be ordinary. His body doesn't decay. At least that's what his embalmers claim. A miracle. Embalming skill. A myth layered in rosinted fabric. We'll never know. But the tale spread fast. Some say it was proof of his divinity. Others say it was proof of very good preservation techniques. His funeral procession was enormous. His sarcophagus made of gold, encased in a chariot with columns and golden lions escorted by soldiers. Musicians, priests, and elephants, originally destined for Macedon. The procession was hijacked en route. Ptolemy, one of his most trusted generals, intercepted the caravan and brought the body to Egypt, where it was interred in Alexandria. And there it remained. For centuries, emperors visited it. Julius Caesar, Augustus, even Caligula allegedly stole Alexander's breastplate. But over time, the tomb was lost, buried beneath layers of sand. And time, to this day, its exact location remains a mystery. What happened next? Chaos. Without Alexander, the empire he'd built began to fracture. His generals, the Diadochi or successors, split the realm into pieces, each claiming power. Wars erupted. Roxana and her son Alexander IV were eventually murdered. Blood soaked the map he once redrew. Within a generation, his united empire was gone. But the legend remained. He had conquered more territory faster than anyone before or since. He had fused cultures, spread ideas, and reshaped history. His name became a template for greatness, stamped on coins, etched into stone, whispered in palaces. Alexander the Great died young, but he lived large. And for all his flaws, and there were many, he remains a symbol of human will taken to its extreme. So, as your eyes close tonight, imagine the dark chamber in Babylon, the flicker of an oil lamp, a king too young and too powerful slipping from this world, his breath slowing, his generals watching, and history holding its breath. After the storm, the world in Alexander's wake. We watched the light flicker out on the most meteoric figure of the ancient world. Alexander the Great, King, Conqueror, God in progress, exited stage, left at the age of 32, leaving behind the biggest empire the world had ever seen and no plan whatsoever. Now we pick through the ashes. Because when someone that powerful dies without a designated adult in the room, you can bet what follows isn't peace and harmony. What followed was the political equivalent of a bar fight in a library. Chaotic, brutal, and full of shouting in multiple languages. Let's start with the problem. No heir. Alexander had a half-brother, Philip III, Aratus, but he was mentally impaired and politically powerless. He also had an unborn child with Roxana, the eventual Alexander IV. But babies aren't great at ruling empires. So, what did his generals do? They argued loudly at sword point. In the days after his death, his top commanders, known as the Diadochi or successors, gathered in Babylon and tried to hold things together. They agreed barely to a joint kingship between Aratus and the soon-to-be-born baby, with the generals acting as regents. This power-sharing arrangement was a political time bomb. Almost immediately, the gloves came off. Alliances formed, fell apart, and reformed faster than a soap opera love triangle. The once unified empire fractured into a mosaic of warring territories, each one ruled by a general who swore loyalty to Alexander's memory while simultaneously plotting to replace it. Let's meet the big players in this imperial brawl. Ptolemy I Sot took Egypt, a region rich in resources and relatively easy to defend. A brilliant tactician and politician, Ptolemy was a longtime friend of Alexander and among his most capable officers. He declared himself pharaoh, established the Ptolemaic dynasty, and transformed Alexandria into a beacon of science, culture, and commerce. The Ptolemies would rule until Cleopatra Iaith, the last of their line, famously tangoed with Rome. Seleucus I Niceta, another veteran of Alexander's campaigns, claimed Babylonia and gradually expanded his control to cover most of the eastern provinces. Modern-day Iraq, Iran, parts of Afghanistan, and even reaching into Central Asia. He founded the Seleucid Empire, blending Greek and Persian administrative traditions. It was massive, multicultural, and perpetually unstable, often at odds with both internal rebels and foreign powers. Antigonus I Monothalamus, yes, the one-eyed, held sway in Asia Minor and had ambitions of restoring the empire in full. He declared himself king, triggering immediate resistance from the others. His bid for supremacy led to the Wars of the Diadochi, decades of conflict that saw shifting alliances, countless battles, and the deaths of nearly all the original generals. Antigonus himself was killed at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 B.C. Lysimachus, who controlled Thrace and parts of Asia Minor, and Cassander, who ruled Macedon and Greece, were also major players in the struggle for supremacy. Cassander, a ruthless operator, was responsible for the murder of Roxana and Alexander Ivth, effectively ending the Argote bloodline. What had been a single unified empire under Alexander splintered into a patchwork of Hellenistic kingdoms, each bearing the scars of war and the echoes of their founders' ambition. Yet, even amid the chaos, Alexander's vision didn't completely die. It evolved. These Hellenistic kingdoms carried Greek language, art, philosophy, and governance into places that had never seen it before. Greek-style cities appeared across Asia and the Middle East. Local elites learned Greek. Scholars translated texts. Trade flourished between East and West. The Hellenistic Age, a roughly 300-year period from Alexander's death to the rise of Rome, became a melting pot of cultures, religions, and ideas. The most famous emblem of this era, the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Its massive library, said to contain hundreds of thousands of scrolls, attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. The museum, no, not the kind with glass cases. Think Research Institute, was home to luminaries like Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference, and Euclid, the father of geometry. But the cultural legacy didn't stop with books. The blending of Greek and Eastern traditions created new forms of art, architecture, and religion. Sculptures from this era show more emotion, more movement, and more realism than the classical models. Gods were syncretized. Greek deities merged with Egyptian and Persian counterparts. Political systems became more complex, more nuanced. And let's not forget Alexander's posthumous celebrity career. In the centuries after his death, his legend only grew. In Persian folklore, he became Iskandar, a wise and noble king. In Islamic tradition, he was identified sometimes controversially with Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran. In medieval Europe, he was transformed into a chivalric knight, his conquests retold in epic romances. His military tactics were studied by Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and countless others. His name appeared in religious texts, imperial propaganda, and bedtime stories. His persona became whatever each culture needed: warrior, philosopher, prophet, tyrant. The man may have died in Babylon, but the idea of Alexander never did. So as you fall asleep tonight, picture the world reshaped by his footsteps. Generals carving up continents, scrolls crossing deserts, empires clashing and coexisting. An age of change born from one man's impossible ambition. Echoes of a titan. The legacy of Alexander today. Now, dear dreamer, we travel beyond scrolls and ruins, beyond spears, statues, and battle cries. We arrive in the present, in the long echoing wake of Alexander the Great. Because for a man who died over 300 years ago, Alexander remains suspiciously everywhere. Let's begin with the physical remnants. His cities still stand. Most notably, Alexandria in Egypt, the crown jewel of his urban planning spree. Founded in 331 BCE, Alexandria was meant to be a monument to Greek culture and a hub for East-West exchange. It succeeded spectacularly. Today, it's Egypt's second largest city, still bearing the name of its founder, still humming with history, from its ancient lighthouse, one of the seven wonders, to its modern library reborn in tribute. The city remains a living relic of Alexander's ambition. His name also graces towns and archaeological sites from Pakistan to Turkey. There's Iskenderun in southern Turkey, Kandahar in Afghanistan derived from Alexandria, and scattered ruins of over 20 cities he founded, all originally named for himself. Subtle, never, permanent, surprisingly. Yes. Now, let's look at the mythology. Alexander's image has been reshaped countless times by the people who inherited or appropriated his legacy. In Persian literature, he is Iskandar, the philosopher king who bridges worlds. In Islamic tradition, he may be Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a figure said to have journeyed to the edges of the earth, built a wall to contain chaos, and ruled justly. In the Romance of Alexander, a medieval bestseller, he travels to the heavens, dives under the sea, and has deep philosophical conversations with trees. And yes, I'm still talking about the same guy who set fire to Pippolis while possibly drunk. In the West, he became the ultimate benchmark. Julius Caesar wept because he had accomplished so little by Alexander's age. Napoleon Bonaparte admired his campaigns and modeled his own mythos after Alexander's. Modern military minds still study his tactics. Historians still debate his decisions. His name adorns ships, statues, schools, and the occasional grilled meat dish. Shout out to Iskender kebab in Turkey. And the cultural debates. They're still raging. Greece and North Macedonia have famously butted heads over who has the right to claim Alexander's legacy. Statues have been unveiled. Flags have been waved. Museums have argued. At the core is a tug-of-war between ancient identity and modern nationalism. all sparked by a man who never once paused to define himself within the borders of the nation-states we know today. In academia, his image continues to evolve. Was he a brilliant unifier or an imperial tyrant? A visionary leader or an eager maniac with a spear? The answer, of course, is yes to all of it. That's what makes him fascinating. Because Alexander the Great wasn't just a man. He was a mirror held up to the ambitions of kings, the dreams of empires, and the fears of those who dare to imagine that one human life can reshape the world. He conquered, but he also built. He destroyed, but he also fused worlds. He wanted to be a god but died like a man. And if you think Alexander's influence stopped with historians and empires, think again. Let's talk pop culture. In Hollywood, he's had his fair share of screen time. The 2004 epic film Alexander, directed by Oliver Stone and starring Colin Farrell, tried to capture the scale of his life with mixed reviews and very dramatic eyeliner. Earlier versions of his story appeared in 1950s sword and sandal flicks. And his name has popped up in everything from Star Trek to video games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Total War Rome. You'll find nods to him in anime, graphic novels, historical fantasy, and even strategy board games. He's been referenced by Jay-Z and Kanye West, who's compared his own ambitious persona to the Conqueror's mythical legacy. His life is the blueprint for the anti-hero genius trope. Flawed, ferocious, too ambitious to live, too extraordinary to ignore. Even fashion has taken inspiration. Capes, breastplates, laurel wreaths. Let's not pretend couture hasn't looked at a bust of Alexander and gone, yes, this but with sequins. And on a more modern note, you can Google Alexander the Great and get results from ancient historiography to TikToks theorizing about his bisexuality. He has fan pages, hashtags, and think pieces. In other words, Alexander has never left the chat. So, as you drift into sleep, think of him not as a figure from dusty textbooks, but as a presence still alive in maps, in legends, in politics, in memes, and in movie trailers, and in the very idea of greatness itself. Alexander is long gone, but the world is still catching its breath. Thank you for listening to the story of Alexander the Great. Rest well, dream boldly, and remember, the past is never really past, especially when it leaves footprints across continents.